He thought it was just a flat tire, until a quiet boy with his eyes and a familiar silver bracelet changed everything he believed about the past he left behind. Ryan Caldwell had never planned to stop that day. His schedule was tight, like always, calls, meetings, decisions that moved millions. He was driving back from a site inspection just outside the city, speeding down a quiet rural highway in his luxury black SUV, when the car began to pull unevenly. A moment later, the dashboard lit up. Flat tire. He muttered under his breath, pulled over, and stepped out of the vehicle with the frustrated detachment of a man who believed problems like this were beneath him. The sun beat down on his navy blue suit, and dust settled on his polished shoes as he popped the trunk and surveyed the tools. He hadn't changed a tire in over a decade. He was bending over when a voice came from behind him, small, clear, and unafraid. "Need help?" Ryan straightened and turned. Standing a few feet away was a boy no older than 7 or 8, with tousled dark hair and a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He wore a slightly stained white t-shirt, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. His posture was confident, almost matter-of-fact, like helping a stranger fix a tire was just another part of his day. Ryan was about to dismiss him with a polite nod when his eyes landed on something unexpected. On the boy's wrist was a thin silver bracelet, dull with time but unmistakably familiar. His breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. He stepped closer, almost unconsciously, trying to get a better look. The bracelet looked exactly like the one he had given Haley 6 years ago. It had been custom-made, engraved with 2 words, "Stay brave." At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, just a gift before he left for the city to expand his business. She had cried when he gave it to her, and he had smiled, thinking they'd pick up where they left off when he came back. He never came back. The boy noticed Ryan staring. "My mom gave it to me," he said simply. "She said it was important to her." Ryan looked down at him again, really looked. The boy's hair was the same shade of deep brown as his own. His nose, his chin, even the way his eyes narrowed in curiosity, it was all familiar. And then there were the eyes. Bright blue. Not sky blue. Not gray. The exact piercing blue that stared back at Ryan in the mirror every morning. His stomach twisted. The boy wasn't just some kid offering help. Something about him felt too connected, too close, like looking into a past that had circled back and punched a hole through his present. He suddenly forgot about the flat tire, about the calls he was missing, about the meeting that would now be rescheduled. "What's your name?" Ryan asked, his voice lower, slower. "Evan," the boy replied, brushing his hands against his jeans. "What's yours?" Ryan stared at him for another long moment. Then, with a strange edge of something like awe or disbelief, he said, "Ryan." Evan didn't react. He just nodded. "Okay. Can I help with the tire now?" Ryan could only nod. And as Evan knelt down next to the wheel, Ryan stood above him in a daze, heart pounding, trying to understand what kind of moment he had just stepped into. All he knew was that nothing in his carefully controlled life would ever be the same again. Ryan stood beside the SUV, watching as the boy knelt confidently by the tire and began inspecting the lug nuts with a seriousness that didn't match his age. Evan's hands were small but steady, and his focus was complete, as if this wasn't the first time he'd helped someone stranded on the side of the road. Ryan didn't know whether to speak, to kneel beside him, or to walk away and gather his thoughts. His instincts were all off. In business, he was decisive, sharp, always 5 moves ahead. But right now, every plan he'd ever known was crumbling under the weight of a bracelet and a child's familiar face. He crouched slowly, trying to keep his voice level. "You've done this before?" Evan nodded without looking up. "Yeah. My mom's car gets old sometimes. We don't always have money for help, so she showed me how." There was no trace of embarrassment in his voice, no hesitation, just the simple reality of a life Ryan had never imagined for Haley. He had left her with promises and ambition, telling himself he'd come back once everything was stable, once the company was launched, once his success had a name. But then came the delays, the pressure, and the silent choice to not look back. Now, looking at Evan, he realized how much had happened while he was building his empire. He hesitated before asking the next question. "What's your mom's name?" Evan looked up briefly, his blue eyes catching the light in a way that made Ryan's chest tighten. Haley. Haley Rivers. The name hit him like a punch. She hadn't changed her name. She hadn't married. Something about that made it worse. It meant she had stayed still while he kept moving forward, without ever turning around. Ryan stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away, suddenly needing air even though they were outside. He turned back after a moment. "How old are you, Evan?" "7, the boy replied, tightening a bolt with a grunt. "Almost 8. 7. Ryan did the math. It lined up. The year he left, the silence, the distance, he had thought she was angry. That maybe she was better off without him. But she had been pregnant. She had been carrying his child, and he had never known. Or worse, never made himself available to know. He looked down at the small, determined boy crouched beside his car, and a swell of regret unlike anything he had ever felt rose in his throat. Evan finished and stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans again. "It's done. You're good to go." Ryan couldn't speak. He reached into his wallet automatically, pulling out a bill without thinking, but the boy shook his head. "I don't want money. I was just helping." That answer, so clear and humble, only twisted the knife deeper. He shoved the bill back into his pocket. "Do you and your mom live around here?" Evan nodded and pointed up the road. "That yellow house with the red porch. We just got it fixed last year." Ryan followed the direction with his eyes. It wasn't far. He could walk there in less than 5 minutes. He imagined Haley inside, maybe cleaning, maybe cooking dinner, completely unaware of the storm that was about to walk back into her life. "Would it be okay if I came by to say thank you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Evan tilted his head, clearly thinking it over like a miniature adult. "I think she'd want that. She talks about you sometimes." That stopped Ryan cold. "She does?" Evan nodded. "Only a little. She said you were smart. And busy. And not very good at calling people back." Ryan laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "Only shame." "That sounds about right." Evan shrugged. "She says we don't need a lot. Just enough. But I think she misses someone. Maybe you." Ryan looked at him again, really looked, and realized that the boy hadn't just changed a tire. He had cracked something open inside him that Ryan didn't know he still had. The cold layers of years gone by, of choices made too easily, of love abandoned for ambition, were starting to peel back. And as Evan ran up the road, disappearing toward the yellow house, Ryan stayed where he was, surrounded by silence, heart pounding, unable to ignore the truth anymore. He had a son. And a second chance. And he wasn't sure he deserved either. But he was going to find out. Ryan didn't drive away. For several minutes after Evan had jogged off toward the house with the red porch, he stood beside his SUV with the repaired tire, hands resting on his hips, heart pounding beneath his crisp shirt. The wind carried the scent of distant pine trees and sun-warmed pavement, but he barely noticed it. All he could see in his mind was that silver bracelet and the child's eyes that mirrored his own. It had taken less than 30 minutes for his entire past to rise from where he'd buried it and plant itself firmly in front of him, alive, talking, helping him with a tire like it was the most natural thing in the world. He got in the car not to leave, but to collect himself. He didn't start the engine. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, emails, missed calls, his assistant's concerned messages about the delay, but none of it mattered. For the first time in years, Ryan didn't feel the pull of the office, the pressure of the market, or the need to be anywhere but exactly where he was. Still, he hesitated. What was he going to say to her? How do you knock on the door of a woman you abandoned and tell her you just met your son on the side of the road? After 15 more minutes of indecision, he finally stepped out, locked the car, and walked slowly toward the house. With each step, memories returned, softer ones, things he hadn't allowed himself to revisit. The first time Haley made him laugh until he cried. The way she used to sit cross-legged on her couch in oversized sweatpants, humming to herself while doing a crossword. The night he gave her the bracelet, telling her it was a reminder to stay strong while he was gone. He hadn't known he would stay gone for good. The house looked worn but cared for. The paint on the porch was chipped in places, but the flowers along the fence were in full bloom. A wind chime tinkled gently above the doorway. He hesitated at the steps. Inside that house was the woman who had once trusted him completely, and the child he had never known he had. His hand hovered near the doorbell, and then finally, he pressed it. The sound echoed inside. A moment passed. Then another. He heard footsteps, light and steady. When the door opened, Haley stood there. For a second, neither of them spoke. She looked different, but not in the way time wears a person down. Her features were the same, delicate but strong, and her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her eyes, though, had changed. They were still the warm hazel he remembered, but now guarded, sharpened with experience and a tired kind of wisdom. She wore a faded t-shirt, jeans, and no makeup. She looked beautiful. "Ryan," she said, voice neutral. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. He had imagined this moment in so many ways on the walk over, and yet now that it was real, he found himself unprepared. I didn't know," he said finally. "I swear I didn't know." She folded her arms. "Didn't know what?" "That I was raising your son alone? That I wore that bracelet for a year after you left, waiting for a call?" Her words weren't angry, but they carried the weight of disappointment layered over pain. Ryan stepped forward slightly. "Haley, I thought you were done with me. I figured I had missed my chance." "You didn't just miss it," she said, her tone quiet. "You erased it. I thought if I left, it would be easier for both of us. That you'd move on. That I wasn't good for you," he said, realizing how hollow it sounded even as he said it. She looked at him, really looked, as if trying to find the truth behind the voice she used to love. "And did you move on, Ryan?" He couldn't lie. "No. Not really." There was a long pause, filled with the sound of distant birds and the creak of the porch railing in the breeze. Finally, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "But only because Evan will want to know if you really showed up." He nodded and stepped inside, not knowing if this was the start of redemption or something even more complicated. But he knew one thing with complete certainty. He wasn't walking away again. The moment Ryan stepped into the house, he was hit by an overwhelming wave of familiarity and strangeness all at once. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon or warm oatmeal. The walls were lined with modest framed photos, drawings in bright crayon colors, and handmade crafts that could only have come from a child's imagination. There was a warmth here that no penthouse apartment or luxury suite he had ever lived in could replicate. It was a home, not polished, not perfect, but alive. He took a slow breath, letting it settle into his chest, and followed Haley into the small living room. She didn't offer coffee or tea, didn't try to make conversation. She simply sat on the arm of the couch, watching him, waiting. Ryan stood in the center of the room, taking in everything. His eyes landed on a photo perched above the fireplace, a snapshot of Evan grinning with a missing tooth, holding what looked like a hand-painted birdhouse. Next to him in the photo was Haley, smiling without makeup, her hair in a messy bun, her eyes tired but happy. There was no man in the picture. No father figure. Just the two of them, a team. "I can't believe how much he looks like me," Ryan said softly, still staring at the photo. "But he's got your heart." He didn't hesitate to help a stranger. Haley gave a short breath of laughter that didn't quite reach her eyes. "He's a good kid." He had to be. He turned to face her. "You should have told me." "I did try," she replied, her voice even. "Once. I called your office when I found out. I left messages. I sent one letter. I never heard back. After that, I stopped trying to make excuses for you." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, guilt tightening around his ribs. He remembered that time. It had been chaos, new investors, long hours, a constant fear that everything he was building would collapse. But what haunted him now wasn't just that he'd missed her calls. It was that he hadn't made himself available to receive them at all. He had left without looking back, without leaving a door open. "I didn't know," he said again, not as an excuse this time, but as a confession. Haley leaned back, arms still crossed. "You didn't want to know." The words were sharp but not unfair. And they cut deep. At that moment, Evan came running into the room, his face lighting up when he saw Ryan. He held a small action figure in one hand and a half-eaten granola bar in the other. "You stayed," Evan said with a grin, as if surprised by his own happiness. "I told you I would," Ryan replied, kneeling down to meet him at eye level. "Wanna see my room?" Evan asked eagerly. "I've got space stuff and a rocket lamp." Ryan glanced up at Haley, unsure if she would allow it. She gave a quiet nod. Evan led him down the hall into a room that was small but full of energy, walls painted with stars, model rockets hanging from the ceiling, books stacked beside the bed. Ryan looked around, his chest tight with a blend of awe and heartbreak. He had missed all of this, the first steps, the bedtime stories, the scraped knees, the quiet triumphs of a little boy discovering the world. "This one's my favorite," Evan said, holding up a drawing of a space shuttle with the word Explorer scrawled underneath in shaky handwriting. "Because it's brave." Ryan stared at the picture, barely able to respond. "You are brave, Evan." The boy looked at him curiously. "My mom says that too. She says being brave means doing what's right, even when it's scary." Ryan nodded, unable to speak for a second. "She's right." They spent a few more minutes in the room, and when Evan finally returned to his coloring book, Ryan stepped out quietly, meeting Haley again in the hallway. Her arms were no longer crossed, but her posture was still cautious. "I know I can't undo anything," he said quietly. "But I want to be part of his life. I want to be there now, however you'll let me." Haley studied him for a long moment. "It's not just about showing up once, Ryan. He's not a meeting you attend and check off your list. He's a person. He'll get attached. He'll believe in you. If you disappear again." "I won't," he said before she could finish. "I swear." She sighed and finally nodded. "Okay. You can start by picking him up from school tomorrow." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. A door cracked open. A second chance in motion. And this time, he was ready to walk through it. The next morning, Ryan stood outside the school 20 minutes earlier than necessary, leaning against his car and watching children stream in and out of the gates. It was a modest public school, surrounded by trimmed hedges and a faded mural on the brick wall that read, "Dream Big." He had never in his life picked up a child from school, let alone waited with anticipation and nerves twisting in his stomach. Business meetings had never made him this uneasy. But this was different. This wasn't about closing a deal or being impressive. This was about showing up, something he had never done when it mattered most. Now, he was determined to start changing that. He had barely slept the night before. He kept replaying every word from Haley, every look, every moment in Evan's room. He thought about the handmade space drawings and the rocket lamp and the way Evan said the word brave like it carried weight. And more than anything, he thought about the moment Haley had said, "Start by picking him up." It wasn't a grand gesture, but to him, it was a bridge. A fragile one. One he didn't dare take for granted. When the bell rang, a flood of students poured out of the building, chattering and running toward parents, older siblings, and school buses. Ryan stood straighter, eyes scanning the crowd until he spotted Evan in the middle of the chaos. The boy's backpack was slightly crooked, and his shoelaces were untied. He looked around, searching, until his gaze landed on Ryan. His face lit up, not in shock, but in confirmation. As if he had expected him to be there all along. "You came," Evan said, walking up quickly, his voice casual but his smile wide. "I told you I would," Ryan said, opening the passenger door for him. "I thought maybe you'd forget," Evan added, climbing in and buckling his seatbelt with exaggerated effort. Ryan didn't answer right away. Instead, he got in the driver's seat, started the engine, and glanced over. "I used to forget things," he said carefully. "Important things. But not anymore. Not you." They drove in comfortable silence for a few minutes, Evan munching on crackers Ryan had thought to bring, the radio playing softly in the background. Eventually, Evan started talking, about school, about how they were learning to add numbers with pictures of apples, about a kid named Drew who got in trouble for hiding glue sticks in his desk. Ryan listened closely, nodding, reacting, asking questions. Every word felt like a gift, a door opening a little more. When they got back to the house, Haley was on the porch watering a few potted plants. She looked up when the car pulled in and watched them for a second before walking down the steps. Evan jumped out and ran to her, lifting his backpack like it held treasure. "Mom, look! He really came. And he brought snacks. Not the healthy kind either." Ryan stepped out more slowly, unsure of how welcome he was in this moment. But Haley gave him a nod, quiet, cautious approval, and that was enough. Later that afternoon, while Evan played with building blocks in the living room, Ryan found himself in the kitchen helping Haley with dinner. She handed him vegetables to chop and didn't correct his technique even when it was clear he didn't know what he was doing. The silence between them was lighter than before, almost companionable. "You're good with him," she said without looking up. "I don't know what I'm doing," Ryan admitted. "I'm just trying not to mess it up." She wiped her hands on a towel and leaned back against the counter. "Kids don't need perfect. They need present. You showed up today. That matters." He looked at her, eyes steady. "I'm not going anywhere." She didn't respond with words, but he saw the faintest shift in her expression, less guarded, a little more open. It wasn't forgiveness yet. But it was trust, beginning to grow like something planted long ago that had finally started pushing through the surface. That night, after dinner and after Evan had fallen asleep on the couch with a toy spaceship clutched in one hand, Ryan stood by the doorway, preparing to leave. Haley walked him out, arms crossed loosely, sweater pulled tight against the cool air. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. She nodded. "Same time." And just before he turned away, she added softly, "Thank you." Ryan walked to his car feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Not pride. Not victory. But connection. Real, messy, unfinished, but real. And he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this was the most important thing he had ever tried to build. Over the next few weeks, Ryan settled into a rhythm that was completely foreign to the life he used to live. He started waking up early not to check the stock market or review investor reports but to pack snacks for Evan and rehearse bedtime stories in his head. He began organizing his business calls around school pickups and learned the exact temperature Evan liked his hot chocolate. It was awkward at first. He didn't know which games Evan liked most, or how to comfort him when he scraped his knee on the sidewalk, but he was learning, slowly, quietly, with a kind of determination he'd never felt for anything else. The walls in Haley's home began to shift. At first, Ryan was a guest, someone who stood just inside the door, unsure of how far he was allowed to step. But as the days passed, he found himself helping Evan with homework at the kitchen table, listening to the same math songs over and over, and folding laundry on the couch while Haley washed dishes. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't easy, but there was an ease building between them, unspoken but undeniable. One Thursday evening, after Evan had fallen asleep early with a crayon still in his hand, Haley and Ryan sat on the front steps with mugs of tea, watching the wind stir the leaves in the yard. The street was quiet, the porch light casting a soft glow over their shoulders. Ryan hadn't planned on staying that long, but every time he thought of leaving, Evan had begged him to stay just a little bit longer, and Haley hadn't said no. Haley sipped her tea and spoke without turning to him. "He asks questions at night when you leave. Like where you go. If you're still going to be here tomorrow." Ryan looked at the stars above, the sharp ache of guilt resting in his chest. "I don't blame him. He doesn't have any reason to believe I'll keep showing up." "He wants to," she said. "He wants to believe in you. And he wants me to believe in you too." Ryan turned to look at her, studying the calm strength in her expression. "Do you?" he asked, not pressing, just asking. Haley took a long breath. "I want to. And that's not something I thought I'd say when I saw you on my doorstep." He gave a quiet laugh, more out of surprise than amusement. "You had every right to slam the door." She finally looked at him. "But I didn't." They sat in silence for a few more minutes, and then she added, almost as an afterthought, "You've changed. You're not the same man who left." Ryan nodded slowly. That man didn't understand what he had. He thought ambition meant cutting everything else out. "I've spent years being successful and alone. I didn't know what I was missing until Evan stood on the side of the road with a wrench in his hand." Haley smiled faintly. "That sounds like him." Ryan set down his mug and leaned forward slightly. "I don't want to just visit his life, Haley. I want to be in it. And not just for Evan. I want to rebuild what I destroyed. If it's too late, I understand. But I'm here because I mean it." She looked down at her hands. "I don't know what this is yet. But I know what it's not. It's not temporary anymore. I've seen you stay. So has he." A breeze rustled through the trees, and for the first time in years, Ryan felt something inside him settle. Not with finality, not with full resolution, but with the quiet hope that he had found his way back to something that had once been real. And now, slowly, it could be real again. Saturday mornings had always been background noise in Ryan's old life, just another day to catch up on reports, respond to international emails, and prepare for Monday. But this Saturday was different. He found himself sitting cross-legged on the carpet of Haley's living room, surrounded by Lego bricks, coloring pages, and the happy hum of Evan narrating a made-up adventure involving a spaceship, a flying sandwich, and a villain named Mr. Socks. Ryan had never built a Lego rocket before. He had never sat on a living room floor for more than 10 minutes without checking his phone. But now he was here, fully present, watching his son light up over every imaginary turn of the story. Evan handed him a bright blue block and said, very seriously, "You have to put this on top, or the whole thing will explode. Trust me, I tested it." Ryan followed his instructions without question, his smile easy and unguarded. He didn't even realize how natural it had become to follow his son's lead, to let go of control, and to simply be someone Evan could count on. Haley watched them from the kitchen, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee, the other tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. She had seen pieces of this new Ryan over the last few weeks, in the way he remembered Evan's favorite snacks, in how he tied his shoes the exact way Evan liked, double-looped and a little loose. But today, watching them laugh on the floor, something inside her softened. She wasn't waiting for him to mess up anymore. She was watching to see if he would stay steady, and he had. Later that day, Evan invited Ryan to see the old oak tree behind the house, the one where he'd built a secret spy base, using branches and rope. Ryan followed him across the backyard, stepping over fallen leaves and the remnants of summer chalk drawings faded on the pavement. When they reached the tree, Evan turned to him, serious again in that way only children could be. "Do you think you're gonna stay forever?" Evan asked. Ryan knelt down to meet him eye to eye. "I want to," he said. "If you and your mom want me to." Evan looked thoughtful, then nodded slowly. "Mom says people leave sometimes. But I think you're trying not to." "I am," Ryan said. "More than anything." Evan reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of string with 3 plastic beads tied in the middle, blue, green, and gold. "It's a lucky charm," he explained. "I made it at school. I was gonna give it to Mom, but maybe you should have it. You need the luck." Ryan accepted it like it was made of gold. "I think this might be the most important thing anyone's ever given me." When they returned to the house, Haley was in the doorway, arms crossed lightly, watching them. She noticed the string in Ryan's hand, the way Evan reached for his fingers without thinking. There was something so normal in it, something so right, that she couldn't push it away. That evening, after Evan fell asleep halfway through a bedtime story Ryan had been reading, Haley walked into the living room while Ryan quietly pulled the blanket over his son. She waited until he stood up and followed her to the kitchen, where she opened a drawer and pulled out a small envelope. "I was going to mail this to you once," she said, handing it to him. "But I didn't." Inside was a photo of Evan as a baby, barely a few months old, wrapped in a soft blanket with his blue eyes wide open. Ryan's breath caught. He ran his fingers gently over the edges of the photo, as if afraid it might disappear. "Why are you giving me this now?" he asked. "Because I think you're ready to understand what you missed," Haley said. "And because I don't want you to miss what's still ahead." There were no speeches, no declarations of forgiveness. But in that moment, a door opened wider than ever before, not just to Evan, but to the pieces of a life Ryan never thought he'd be allowed to reclaim. And this time, he didn't need to be asked to stay. He already knew he would. Sunday came with golden light filtering through the curtains and the smell of pancakes drifting through the house. Ryan stood at the stove, wearing an apron that said, "Chef in Training," in bold lettering, a gift Evan had insisted on giving him just a few days earlier. The batter was a little too thick, and the first few pancakes came out lopsided, but Evan declared them the best ever, with syrup dripping off his chin and a thumbs up that made Ryan feel like he had just won a prize more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed. Haley was sipping her coffee at the table, barefoot, hair still slightly messy from sleep, watching them with a softness that hadn't been there weeks ago. She didn't try to take over the cooking or correct him. She simply let the moment unfold, and that, more than anything, told Ryan they had turned a corner. After breakfast, they all walked to the park. Evan rode his small bike ahead of them, shouting occasional updates about imaginary obstacles on the sidewalk and pretending he was a space explorer on a secret mission. Haley and Ryan followed behind at a slower pace, walking side by side in a silence that didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Comfortable. Ryan had never walked like this before, with no agenda, no need to impress or prove anything. Just the steady rhythm of one step after another, the sound of laughter in the air, and Haley's shoulder occasionally brushing his when their arms swayed too close. At the park, Evan ran to the swings, his energy endless, and Ryan pushed him higher and higher while Haley sat on a nearby bench, smiling to herself as she watched them. After a while, Evan jumped off the swing mid-air and landed with a dramatic superhero pose, brushing imaginary dirt off his knees. "Did I fly?" he asked, breathless. "You flew," Ryan said. "Higher than I ever did." When they got home that afternoon, Ryan helped Evan with a craft project for school, a poster about families. Evan insisted on including photos, so they printed a few using Haley's old printer. One was of the three of them at the park, another of Evan in his space-themed pajamas with Ryan beside him reading a bedtime story. The last one was the baby photo Haley had given Ryan the night before. Evan looked at it, eyes wide with recognition and curiosity. "Was that me?" he asked. Haley nodded. "That was you, not long after you were born." "Was Dad there?" Evan looked between them. Ryan's heart squeezed, but he met his son's eyes. "I wasn't, buddy. But I should have been. I didn't know then. But now I do. And I'm here now. Every day." Evan nodded slowly and added a heart sticker next to the baby photo. "Then it's okay." That evening, while Evan slept with his arms around his stuffed rocket and the house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floor, Haley walked Ryan to the door. But this time, she didn't just stand at the threshold. She leaned against the frame, watching him with something different in her expression, something settled, something real. "You've kept your word," she said. "You didn't disappear." "I won't," he said. "Not ever again." Haley stepped forward, closed the small distance between them, and for the first time in years, reached for his hand. She didn't say anything else, and she didn't have to. The gesture said everything. Ryan squeezed her hand gently, and they stood there, not as broken people trying to rewrite the past, but as two people willing to write the future together. Not perfect. Not rushed. Just honest. In that moment, under the quiet porch light with the scent of spring in the air and the echo of Evan's laughter still in their minds, Ryan knew he had finally built something that mattered. Something real. Something worth everything he had once thought he needed to chase. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. From an author's perspective, the ending of this story isn't just happy, it's deeply earned. It doesn't offer a fairy tale resolution or instant harmony, as fictional narratives often do. Instead, it shows a journey, a slow, awkward, but sincere process of returning. Ryan isn't a hero by nature, he's a man who made mistakes, and that's exactly what makes his path meaningful. He didn't get a second chance, he earned it through presence, patience, and honesty. What stands out most is that the ending leaves space to breathe. There are no dramatic declarations, no idealized moments. There's a quiet touch, a simple, "you stayed," and that's enough. Because real love isn't found in words, it's proven through action. And the story's final note reflects that, it's not about reclaiming the past, but about becoming worthy of the present. He built an empire with a heart of stone, until the day he walked into a government building and saw his ex scrubbing the floor, with two identical little girls who looked just like him. Evan Blake was the kind of man whose name opened doors before he even stepped through them. In the business world, he was known as a powerhouse, a billionaire CEO with an iron mind, ruthless instincts, and a reputation for results. He was the kind of leader people feared more than admired, and that suited him just fine. He didn't waste time on emotions, didn't believe in apologies, and certainly didn't believe in regret. To him, success was a numbers game, and he had been winning for over a decade. He lived in glass towers and private jets, surrounded by people who were paid to agree with him. His life was perfectly calculated, down to the minute. Feelings, vulnerability, and connection were liabilities he had removed long ago. Somewhere in the background of that relentless climb, there had been a woman. Julia. Soft-spoken, fiercely intelligent, and grounded in a way that had once drawn him in. She wasn't impressed by his ambitions. She challenged him, made him laugh at himself, something no one else had ever dared to do. But when the opportunity came to leave their small college town and build his empire in New York, Evan didn't hesitate. He left Julia behind without a second glance. He told himself it was necessary. That she would be fine. That he had bigger things to do. And over the years, he buried the memory of her beneath contracts, takeovers, and the hollow praise of people who wanted something from him. In his world, success was the only language that mattered. Love? That was a story for people who didn't have enough work to do. But life, despite all his planning, had a way of circling back. 6 years later, Evan returned to the very town he had once escaped from. He told himself it was just business, he needed to finalize the lease for a new development site. A quick trip. Nothing more. The past was irrelevant. He arrived in a black car, wearing a tailored coat, scanning the familiar streets with cold detachment. Nothing about the place felt like it could touch him anymore. He was beyond it. Untouchable. That belief would only last another hour. Evan stepped into the municipal building with the same purposeful stride he carried into every boardroom. The air inside was cooler than he remembered, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. The tiled floor beneath his polished shoes gleamed unnaturally bright under the fluorescent lights. He glanced at his watch, already irritated that his attorney was running late. Small-town inefficiency, he thought. He moved toward the main lobby, scanning the bland beige walls, prepared to wait a few minutes before getting back to the real world. But then something caught his eye. Just past the reception desk, near the large glass doors that led to a maintenance hallway, a woman was on her knees scrubbing the floor with a soaked rag and a bucket of water beside her. That alone didn't register. He had seen janitors and cleaning crews in countless places without ever really seeing them. What stopped him was the movement next to her. 2 small girls, barely 5 years old, were crouched low on the ground beside her, giggling softly as they wiped at the tile with tiny cloths. Their cheeks were flushed, and their golden curls were tied back in messy ponytails. They were talking to each other in that secret language children often share, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched. Both girls looked nearly identical, same eyes, same nose, same energy pulsing through their quick movements. At first, Evan felt a jolt of disapproval. What kind of mother let her children work like this? Was this legal? Was this safe? He was already stepping forward, prepared to say something when the woman looked up. Time stopped. It was Julia. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, practical bun, and she wore no makeup. There were faint lines beneath her eyes and a weariness in the way she held her shoulders, but it was her. Unmistakably. The same woman he had once shared late-night dreams with, whispered futures into. And here she was on her knees, scrubbing a government floor, while 2 children, 2 little girls, worked beside her. Julia stared at him for a long moment, frozen. Her expression flickered between shock, confusion, and something unreadable. She didn't rise. Didn't speak. The girls looked up when they noticed her stillness. One of them tilted her head and stared directly at Evan, her green eyes wide and unblinking. It was the eyes that undid him. His world tilted. Because he recognized them. Not from memory, but from every mirror he'd ever looked into. That same sharp green, that same intensity. And just like that, Evan understood. These weren't just children helping a tired mother. These were his children. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His throat was dry. His thoughts were a mess of disbelief and questions. He looked at Julia again, and her face confirmed it. She hadn't said a word, but she didn't need to. The past he had buried was no longer behind him. It was standing right in front of him, scrubbing a tiled floor with matching green eyes. Evan barely registered the people walking through the lobby, the faint echo of shoes on tile, or the distant hum of conversation. Everything else disappeared, drowned beneath the weight of the moment as he stared at Julia and the 2 little girls beside her. The realization hadn't fully settled, but something deeper than logic had already confirmed what he feared and somehow hoped was true. These children weren't just strangers with familiar features. They were his. His daughters. And he had never even known they existed. He stepped closer, not out of control but with the slow, stunned motion of a man approaching something too big to fully comprehend. Julia stood up as he neared, wiping her hands on the faded cloth in her pocket, her jaw tight and eyes unreadable. The girls clung to her legs instinctively, looking up at the tall stranger who now stood only a few feet away. "Are they mine?" he asked, his voice low, barely audible, more breath than sound. For a moment, she didn't answer. Then she nodded once, the smallest movement, but it struck him harder than any word could have. His world shifted. Years of perfectly arranged priorities, sterile penthouses, and empty victories unraveled in a single breath. He looked down at the girls again. They weren't afraid of him. Just curious. One of them tilted her head, her expression thoughtful, as if she recognized something in him that even he didn't. The other hid slightly behind Julia, but peeked out to study him with the same narrowed gaze he'd used in boardrooms for years. He cleared his throat, struggling for words. "Why didn't you tell me?" Julia's eyes met his, steady now, even as her voice was quiet. "I tried. I left messages. Emails. I even came to your office once in New York. Your assistant sent me away. Said you weren't available for personal visits. I sent a letter after they were born. No response. Eventually, I stopped trying. You'd made it clear what mattered to you." Evan's chest ached with something foreign. Guilt wasn't an emotion he'd spent much time entertaining in his life, but now it crashed over him in waves. Not because he had missed 5 years of his daughters' lives, though that alone was unbearable, but because Julia had tried. And he had been too far removed from the real world to notice. "I didn't know," he said. "If I had." She cut him off, but not cruelly. "But you didn't. That's the point." The girls tugged at her hands, clearly sensing the tension but not understanding it. One of them whispered something, and Julia leaned down to listen. When she stood again, her voice had softened just a little. "They're okay, Evan. I've done my best. They're happy. They don't know you, but they've asked about you. I didn't lie to them. I told them you were somewhere far away, doing important work." He swallowed hard. "I don't want to be far anymore." Julia said nothing. She just watched him, trying to decide if she believed the sincerity in his voice. Evan didn't blame her. He barely believed himself. For the first time in years, he didn't know what the next step should be. He only knew he had to take it. He crouched down slowly, meeting the girls at their eye level. They didn't back away. One of them stepped forward and reached out, touching the edge of his coat like she was testing whether he was real. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "I'm Mia," she said proudly. Then pointed at her sister. "That's Lily." "Hi, Mia." "Hi, Lily," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm Evan." They both looked at him for a moment. Then Mia asked, "Are you the man from the picture in Mommy's drawer?" Julia's breath caught, and Evan turned his head sharply toward her, stunned. Julia nodded slightly. "They found a photo years ago. I didn't hide it." Lily whispered something to Mia, then looked up at Evan and asked, "Are you our dad?" He didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I am." Neither girl ran to him. They didn't scream or cry. But Mia smiled. Just a little. And that was enough to undo him. He stood slowly, looking at Julia again, his voice steadier now. "Let me know them. Let me earn this." She looked at him a long time before finally answering. "We'll see," she said. "But not for your sake. For theirs." The next few days passed like a strange dream Evan couldn't quite wake from. He returned to his hotel each evening with his mind racing, full of things no business meeting had ever prepared him for. For the first time in his adult life, he had no plan. No blueprint, no timeline, no strategy. He had built companies from the ground up, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, and dismantled failing departments with ruthless efficiency. But nothing in his experience had taught him how to approach two 5-year-old girls who looked at him like a mystery they weren't sure they wanted to solve. Julia didn't call, and he didn't push. He knew better than to demand anything now. Instead, he stayed in town longer than intended, canceling meetings and sending vague excuses to his board. His assistant was bewildered. Evan didn't explain. How could he? There were no words that could summarize what had happened in the lobby of that building, no phrase to wrap around the realization that he had 2 daughters who had lived 5 whole years without him. On the 3rd day, just as he was beginning to wonder if Julia had shut the door for good, she sent a message through the front desk of his hotel. It was written on a small notepad from the cleaning company she worked for. All it said was, "They asked about you again. We'll be at the park after 4. Evan read the note at least a dozen times before tucking it into his jacket pocket like something fragile. He arrived early. Too early. The park was quiet, the grass still damp from a light afternoon rain. He sat on a bench beneath a tree, watching parents push strollers and children chase each other across the playground. It was a scene he had never been part of, a world that had always existed parallel to his own but out of reach. Until now. When Julia arrived, she was holding both girls by the hand. They wore matching rain boots and carried a plastic bag full of crackers to feed the ducks. They spotted him almost immediately. Mia waved first. Lily followed, slower, more hesitant, but not hiding. Julia gave him a small nod, the kind that said, "This isn't for you. It's for them." He stood to greet them, unsure whether to hug, speak, or simply kneel down. Mia solved it for him by running over and holding up her hand like a traffic officer. "We made rules," she said seriously. "You can come to the park with us, but no phone and no boss voice." Evan blinked, then smiled. "Deal." They sat together on the edge of the pond, tossing crackers into the water. The girls talked easily between themselves, occasionally including him in their observations about ducks, clouds, or how they thought rainbows were made. He answered every question honestly, even when they asked strange ones, like whether he'd ever ridden a unicorn or eaten spaghetti with a spoon. Every now and then, Lily would glance at him sideways, as if trying to piece together where he fit in her life. He didn't force it. He let her look. Julia sat nearby on the grass, watching with a guarded expression. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't leaving either. That was enough. After about an hour, when the crackers were gone and the ducks had wandered off, Mia sat beside Evan and said, "We don't have a dad. But you can be one if you're nice." He looked at her, startled by her boldness, by the innocence in her voice that somehow carried more weight than any accusation. "I want to be," he said, careful not to speak like a businessman. "If you'll let me." Lily had crawled closer and was now leaning against his leg without saying anything. She didn't look up. She just stayed there, quiet and warm, and Evan didn't move. Julia stood then and walked over slowly. She didn't speak for a long time. Finally, she said, "They're not a prize, Evan. You don't win them. You show up." He nodded. "I'm here. Let's see if you stay." Then she turned and took the girls' hands, and they walked away. Evan remained on the bench for a while after they were gone, listening to the sounds of children playing and ducks rustling in the reeds. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't even realized he'd lost, a sense of purpose not tied to profit, not rooted in ego. He had made his fortune by moving fast. But this would take time. And he was ready for that. Evan began showing up at the park every afternoon at 4. He didn't ask permission. He didn't send messages. He simply arrived, sat on the same bench beneath the tall oak tree, and waited. At first, it felt unnatural, even humiliating. This man who once commanded rooms now sitting alone in a public park hoping 2 5-year-old girls would want to see him. But with each passing day, it began to feel less like penance and more like possibility. Some days, Julia and the girls came. Some days, they didn't. On the days they did, Mia always ran ahead and greeted him with a handful of questions. Lily was quieter, more observant, often holding back until she decided he had earned her presence that day. It was a slow process, painfully slow for someone used to immediate results. But Evan adjusted. He learned to speak their language, not the baby talk he had once imagined children required, but the honest, curious rhythm of two small people testing the world around them. They asked about his job, his house, if he had pets, why his shoes were always shiny. He answered everything without defensiveness, even when the questions stung more than they should have. He brought snacks sometimes, juice boxes and crackers, apples sliced just the way Mia liked them. He never brought toys or flashy gifts, though he had the resources to do so. He wanted them to know him, not what he could buy. Eventually, the girls began to look for him before they even reached the bench. When they saw him, their steps quickened. That was when he knew something had changed. One late afternoon, as the light turned gold and the shadows stretched long across the park grass, Julia sat next to him for the first time. She didn't speak right away. The girls were playing a few feet away, giggling as they tried to build up a fort out of sticks and a forgotten picnic blanket. "They talk about you more now," she said quietly, not looking at him. Evan kept his eyes on the girls. "Good things?" Julia smiled faintly. "Mostly. Mia told her teacher she has a dad who used to live in a castle but decided to come live near the playground instead." He laughed under his breath. "That's not far from the truth." Julia's face grew more serious. "She asked me last night if you're going to disappear again." The words hit him harder than he expected. He turned toward her, his voice lower now. "I won't." "You say that now," she replied. "But they're 5. Everything new becomes permanent to them. If you go, they won't forget. And they'll think it was because of them." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm still here." They sat in silence after that. It wasn't comfortable, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two people trying to exist in the same world again after years of being strangers. Later, as the girls began to gather their things and prepare to leave, Mia ran up to him, her cheeks pink and glowing from the play. "We drew something for you," she announced, pulling a folded piece of paper from her jacket. She handed it to him proudly. On the inside was a crayon drawing of 4 figures holding hands, 2 tall, 2 small. The small ones had pigtails. The tall ones were labeled, Mommy and Dad. Evan stared at the drawing, unable to speak. Lily hovered beside him, watching his face. "Do you like it?" she asked. He swallowed. "It's the best thing I've ever been given." Julia walked over slowly and saw the picture. She didn't say anything, but something in her expression shifted, just slightly. That night, back in his rented apartment, Evan taped the picture to the wall above the small desk where he used to answer emails. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't check his calendar. He sat in the quiet, looking at that piece of crayon-covered paper, and let it remind him that some things were worth starting late, as long as you showed up. The first time Mia called him Dad without hesitation, it happened so naturally that Evan almost missed it. They had been sitting on the living room floor of Julia's apartment, surrounded by colored pencils, glitter glue, and half-folded pieces of construction paper. Lily was curled up on the couch, tired after a long day, while Mia insisted they make official family cards to hang on the refrigerator. Evan had never done anything like this before. He'd signed legal documents, architectural blueprints, and contracts worth hundreds of millions, but never something made of paper and stickers that said, "My dad is awesome," in uneven handwriting. She held up her drawing and grinned. "Dad, can you help me cut this part?" It was just a sentence. Casual. Unforced. But it echoed in his chest like a bell. She hadn't looked up or paused or waited for a reaction. She had simply said it, like it had always been true. He reached for the scissors with hands that trembled slightly. He looked across the room at Julia, who had heard it too. She didn't react outwardly, but she stopped mid-step and stood still for a second longer than necessary before continuing toward the kitchen. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed and the apartment had grown quiet, Julia offered him tea. They sat on opposite sides of the couch, the distance between them still filled with history, unspoken questions, and the slow work of rebuilding trust. He didn't bring up the moment, not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. She did instead. "She called you Dad today," Julia said, her voice soft but steady. "I noticed," he replied, carefully neutral. "She's never said it to anyone before," she added, and that made him turn to face her. There was no resentment in her tone, no bitterness, just the weight of the truth. "I didn't expect it," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd earned that yet." "You haven't," she said, not unkindly. "But kids don't work like that. They give their hearts before you've proven you deserve them. And then they watch to see if you break it. Evan let that settle between them. Then I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I don't." Julia looked tired, but it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that came from parenting alone, it was the kind that came from carrying hope and fear at the same time. "You've been showing up. I didn't think you would. I thought you'd disappear after a week, once the novelty wore off or the guilt started to fade." "I almost did," he confessed, surprising himself with the honesty. "Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't think I deserved any of this. I still don't. But I want to be here. Not just as a guest or a name in a phone book. I want to be part of their lives, and if you'll let me, part of yours." Julia didn't answer immediately. She sipped her tea, stared at the framed crayon drawing the girls had made earlier that now sat propped on a shelf. "They adore you," she finally said. "Even Lily, and she doesn't warm to people quickly. They trust you, Evan. That means I have to start trying to trust you too." He nodded. "Whatever pace you need. I'm not going anywhere." It was the first time he'd said that and truly meant it. Later, as he stood by the door preparing to leave, she surprised him again. "You don't have to knock next time," she said. "Just come in." And just like that, the wall between them didn't fall completely, but a door was opened. Small, quiet, but real. He stepped out into the cold night air, the city dim around him, and for the first time in years, he felt grounded. He wasn't just chasing redemption anymore. He was building something, fragile, imperfect, but real. And he was ready to fight for it. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm Evan had never known before. His life, once driven by urgency and ambition, began to revolve around school pickups, grocery lists, bedtime stories, and tiny, miraculous moments that had nothing to do with business. He learned that Lily liked her toast with exactly 3 drops of honey, that Mia couldn't fall asleep unless the closet door was fully shut, and that both of them insisted on wearing mismatched socks because they were more fun that way. These small details might have seemed meaningless to someone else, but to Evan, they were everything. Every habit, every request, every messy drawing was a piece of a world he never thought he'd be allowed to enter. And now he was living in it. Julia watched all of this quietly. She didn't interfere when the girls piled books into Evan's lap and demanded stories, or when he burnt pancakes and made the entire kitchen smell like smoke. She didn't scold when he brought them home 20 minutes late because they insisted on counting every flower in the park. She watched him slowly turn into the kind of man she once thought he couldn't be. It wasn't perfect. He still answered work calls too often and sometimes forgot where the extra socks were kept. But he tried. And trying, in Julia's eyes, was more than he had ever done before. One evening, just after dinner, the girls were curled up in a blanket fort they'd built in the living room, their laughter echoing through the apartment. Julia stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, and Evan was drying dishes beside her. It was quiet, warm, the kind of peace that only came when nothing extraordinary was happening. And yet, it felt extraordinary in its own way. "I used to picture this," she said softly, without looking at him. "Not exactly like this, but, you hear? Us together." Then I stopped. It hurt too much to imagine something that never came. Evan placed a plate carefully into the cabinet and leaned back against the counter. I didn't even let myself imagine it. I was too busy pretending it didn't matter. Julia finally turned to look at him, her face calm but serious. "Why now? Why did you really stay?" He hesitated before answering, not because he didn't know, but because the truth still felt fragile inside him. "Because I saw them. And I saw you. And for the first time, I realized I'd built my whole life around the wrong things. I have more money than I can spend, more power than I ever needed. But I never felt anything real until I saw Mia holding your hand and wiping the floor beside you." She nodded slowly, absorbing his words. There was a long silence, filled only with the soft sounds of the girls' voices from the other room. "I'm not asking for a second chance," he continued. "I'm asking for a first one. The one I never gave myself, or you, or them." Julia looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know what this will be, Evan. I don't know if I can call it family again. But you've become part of their world, and I can't imagine taking that away from them. Or from you." His chest tightened at the quiet acknowledgement. He didn't need more than that. Not yet. That night, after the girls had fallen asleep under their mountain of pillows and stuffed animals, Julia walked Evan to the door. Before he left, she handed him a small folded piece of paper. It was a permission slip for the school's parent breakfast day. "They asked if you'd come," she said. He looked down at the form, stunned. "Are you sure?" "They already told their teacher you would," she added, smiling just a little. "You better not make them liars." He chuckled quietly, more touched than he could say. "I wouldn't miss it for anything." When the door closed behind him, Evan stood in the hallway for a moment, staring at the paper in his hand. It was small, barely bigger than a postcard, printed with cartoon eggs and smiling coffee cups. But to him, it might as well have been the most important document he had ever signed. Because this time, he wasn't building a company. He was building a life. The morning of the school's parent breakfast arrived cold and bright, the kind of morning that wrapped the world in pale gold light and crisp air. Evan woke up earlier than he needed to, the nerves in his chest tight and unfamiliar. He had stood on the stages of global conferences, faced investors who'd flown halfway across the world to challenge his decisions, but nothing had ever made his palms sweat the way this did. It wasn't fear of failure, it was the weight of being seen. Not as a CEO or a strategist, but as a father, something he was still learning how to become. He wore a soft blue sweater Mia had once said made him look less serious, and he arrived 10 minutes early, clutching a small tray of blueberry muffins he had stayed up late baking with Julia's guidance. When he walked through the school doors, the hallway was already buzzing with the chaotic joy of young children and nervous parents. He caught a glimpse of construction paper artwork taped to the walls, names written in bold, uneven letters, and drawings of stick-figure families under smiling suns. At the classroom door, he paused. He could hear their voices, high, excited, and familiar in a way that tugged at something deep in him. When he stepped inside, both Mia and Lily spotted him at the same time and ran toward him, wrapping their arms around his legs with a force that nearly knocked him backward. The teacher smiled, greeting him with the calm familiarity of someone who already knew who he was. The girls beamed with pride as they led him to their table, where a paper place card labeled "Daddy" had been carefully drawn in purple marker and glitter. For the next hour, Evan listened to the girls talk about their favorite books, their plans for recess, and how they were learning to spell the word important. They took turns feeding him bites of pancakes and insisted he try the school juice, which was totally weird but kind of good. They introduced him to their classmates as their dad, and each time the word left their mouths, it echoed a little louder in his heart. Julia arrived near the end of the breakfast. She stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him seated between the girls, his hands sticky with syrup and his hair slightly mussed from where Mia had tried to fix it. There was something in her gaze, something fragile and soft, that hadn't been there before. When their eyes met, she didn't look away. After the breakfast, Evan walked them back to class. The girls clung to his hands until the last possible second, and before disappearing through the doorway, Mia turned and whispered, "You came. I knew you would." Back outside, Julia waited with her coat wrapped tightly around her. They walked in silence toward the car, but it wasn't the silence of discomfort anymore. It was something shared. Something healing. "I signed the girls up for a weekend art class," she said after a while. "They asked if you'd come with them." Evan smiled, his voice steady. "Of course I will." Julia stopped walking. She looked at him with eyes that no longer carried walls. "You're not the same man who left." "I know," he said. "He didn't deserve any of this. But I'd give everything to be worthy of it now." She nodded, and in that quiet nod was 1,000 things neither of them said aloud. Forgiveness. Trust. A future they hadn't dared to hope for before. Weeks passed. Evan moved into a smaller home not far from Julia's, one with a front porch where the girls could sit and draw chalk masterpieces in the sun. He still worked, still built, but everything was different. He measured time in bedtime stories and school calendars instead of quarterly reports. He planned his life around art shows and pancake breakfasts, not boardroom summits. And slowly, Julia began to let him in, not just as the father of her daughters, but as someone who could stand beside her, not in apology, but in presence. On a quiet Sunday evening, as the girls played outside and the sky turned a dusky pink, Julia stood beside Evan on the porch, her coffee warm in her hands. He reached over and gently brushed a curl from her face. She didn't pull away. "Are we okay?" he asked. She looked at him, really looked, and then smiled, the kind of smile he remembered from years ago, before the silence, before the distance. "We're getting there," she said. "And this time, we're going together." The sound of laughter echoed from the yard. The sun dipped low, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like a question or a risk. It felt like a promise.